Okay, so today we're going to look at extending the diagram from yesterday, the cast diagram, to include negative angles and angles that are bigger than 360 degrees. A positive angle starts on the positive x-axis at 0, and it moves anticlockwise around your diagram. So this would be, say, positive 130. A negative angle also starts on the positive x-axis at 0, but this one moves clockwise around the cast diagram. So if you had a negative acute angle, say like negative 40, that would be in this fourth quadrant. See, this negative acute angle is in quadrant 4. So what we do is we include angles of negative theta into our cast diagram. All right, so a negative theta is always in the fourth quadrant. So we need to look at what those ratios are doing. So this is a fourth quadrant angle, like yesterday. We've identified it. It's a fourth quadrant. Negative theta is in the fourth quadrant. Sine in the fourth quadrant is a negative. So we take it to negative sine of the acute angle positive theta. Okay, so this negative here in front is not the same as that negative inside the bracket. You are asking what that ratio is doing in the fourth quadrant. All right, so tan of negative theta, where is negative theta? It's in the fourth quadrant. In the fourth quadrant, tan is negative because only cos is positive. So we write negative tan of the acute angle theta. And then cos, what quadrant is negative theta in? The fourth quadrant. Cos in the fourth quadrant, well, hopefully by now you know that in the fourth quadrant cos is positive. So that would change to positive cos theta. All right, so all we really need to remember is that if you see an angle of negative theta, you identify it as being in the fourth quadrant, and we work from there. Okay, now what happens if you have an angle that is bigger than 360? So like 360 plus an acute angle of theta. All right, so if you can imagine, let me just write this here, 0, 90, 180, 270, 360. So it's a positive angle, so we start on the positive x-axis and we move all the way around. That would be 360 degrees. Okay, anti-clockwise. Now we still need to move. So there's a 360, this first part, that's a 360. Now this little piece here would be the theta. So 360 degrees plus a theta would end up back in the first quadrant. So whenever you see 360 plus theta, you know it is a first quadrant angle. So if we were looking at let's look at our cast diagram quickly. Sorry, I just want to get, okay, so all sinners turn costly. We said this is theta. This is 180 minus theta in the second quadrant. This was from yesterday, 180 plus theta, and 360 minus theta. We've now added from the previous page that if it is negative theta, it's also in the fourth quadrant. And now I've just tried to show you that 360 degrees plus a theta would end up in the first quadrant. 360 round plus a little angle of theta would be back in the first quadrant. So we have to remember those two extra now for our cos diagram. We're adding those two on. So if we wanted to try and just do an example that needed simplifying, remember we always start by asking which quadrant are we working in. So where is the terminal arm of the angle that I'm looking at? Alright, so let's have a look at this. Okay, so we're simplifying this. Sine of negative theta, we just said that negative theta is a fourth quadrant angle. So I've identified that it's in that's quadrant 1, quadrant 2, quadrant 3, and quadrant 4. That is a fourth quadrant angle. Alright, tan of 180 plus, where's 180 plus? Here it is, it's in the third quadrant. 180 minus, there it is, in the second quadrant. So I'm identifying where my angles are. 180 minus again, second quadrant. 360 minus, here it is in the fourth quadrant. And then cos of negative theta, well, we've just said that negative theta is in the fourth quadrant. Okay, so we start by identifying the quadrant like we were doing yesterday. And then we decide, is it positive or negative? So let's see. Sine in the fourth. Well, sine in the fourth quadrant is negative. So we write negative sine and we reduce it to theta. Tan in the third, that's positive. So you can write the positive sign, but you don't need to. And we reduce it to positive tan of theta. Remember, we always reduce it to this theta, this acute angle here. Cos in the second, negative. And we reduce it to the theta. Sine in the second is positive. And again, you don't have to write that positive. You can. I'm going to put it in there. Tan in the fourth is negative. Here's the fourth quadrant, and in this fourth quadrant only cos is positive, which means tan is negative. And then finally, cos in the fourth quadrant, well, here we go, cos in the fourth is positive, so that's positive cos theta. Okay, so now what are we going to do? We are now going to simplify. So positive or negative and reduce. And when we simplify, we use algebra. And I can't spell. Algebra rules. So if you can do it to algebra, you can do it to trig. All right, so it's one term over one term, which means that that sign can cancel once into that one. Tan can go into tan, and cos can go into their once and once. So what am I left with? Well, I've got 1 times 1 times 1, which would give me 1 at the top. Negative times a positive times a negative would give me a positive 1 at the top. Positive times a negative times a positive, that's going to give me a negative 1 at the bottom. 1 times 1 times 1. So that's going to end up being positive over a negative is a negative. 1 over 1 is 1. Okay, and then one more quick one. Let's simplify this. Oopsie. So we've got the cos of 360 plus x, sine 360 minus x. Okay, so you should be thinking about straight away your cos diagram. And remember, this x is exactly the same as a theta. It's an acute angle that we're looking at. Okay, so here's my cos diagram. theta. Now we added 360 plus theta in the first quadrant. 180 minus second, 180 plus third, 360 minus, and negative theta as well now in the fourth quadrant. Okay, so start by identifying which quadrant you're in. Okay, so cos of 360 plus x, the same as 360 plus theta. There it is there in the first quadrant. So this is a first quadrant angle. 360 minus x, that's the same as 360 minus theta. That's in the fourth quadrant. Cos of negative x, same as negative theta, fourth quadrant. And sine of x plus 360, well, that would be the same as 360 plus x. Just changing the order there. So that's going to be in the first quadrant. All right, once we've identified the quadrants, we decide if they're going to be positive or negative. So cos in the first quadrant is positive, and then you go to the acute angle, and the acute angle in this one is an x. Sine in the fourth, well, sine in the fourth would be a negative. So we reduce it again. Cos in the fourth is positive. So positive cos and the acute angle x. And then sine in the first, well, all the ratios are positive in the first. So it's positive sine x. Okay, we're going to reduce it. We're going to simplify it. So cos divides into that one, and I'm allowed to divide because it's one term over one term. Okay, what am I left with? Positive times a negative is a negative, and 1 times 1 is 1. Positive times a positive is a positive. 1 times 1 is 1. And that leaves me with a negative 1. So every sum is exactly the same. The most important thing is you remember your cos diagram and how you're going to decide which quadrant they're going to be in.